Hello, this is the Reverend Tom Muller. I am the managing editor of Our Daily Bread at spiritualquesters.org, which is a publication of the Swedenborgian Church of North America. Thank you so much for tuning into our program today. I have with me today Bishop Stephan Hoeller, who is the bishop of the Ecclesia Gnostica and has been a household name, I would say, within the students and practitioners of Gnosticism and the Western esoteric tradition. Has kind of been a very great resource over the decades in providing scholarship as well as theological input and so forth on the themes of Gnosticism, depth psychology, theosophy, and so forth. And it's an honor to welcome Bishop Hoeller with me today to have a conversation about what I like to call ecumenical esoteric spirituality or esoteric ecumenism. The notion that it's important for us sort of smaller movements within the Western esoteric tradition to be in dialogue with each other, to be in community with each other, and to learn from each other as we move into this kind of new stage of the information age and everything that is changing in our society. So Bishop Hoeller, thank you so much for being with us today. And I invite you to kind of just share a little bit about yourself personally and your personal history and your journey, both academically, spiritually. So I'd love to just have you share a little bit about yourself, Bishop Hoeller.
Thank you very much for this invitation, Reverend Muller. And I think that the objectives of our interaction are important. As to myself, as you say, in certain circles, particularly circles related to Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Theosophy, and pretty much all that is called the Western esoteric tradition, I have become a sort of a household word or name, and which is understandable due to the fact that I have been active in this field for a very long time. Last November, I just passed my 90th birthday, and I would say that a good 3/4 or more of that lifespan was really devoted to these studies and these activities. Now, as to myself biographically, I'll keep it very short. I am a native of Hungary in Eastern Europe. I was born in Budapest, in Hungary, and lived there until the takeover of the communist element under Russian pressure, and I was able to leave the country in December of 1947, and lived then for a number of years, only for less than a year in Belgium, and after that for some 8 or 9 years in Austria. The latter I always considered very happy period, because somehow the long history of living in under the same crown and in the same dual monarchy has joined the Hungarians and the Austrians together, I think, to a very great extent. And so I might say I was quite happy in Austria, but these were also very bad times. We are now up only to the, in my story, to the kind of about 1950 and thereabouts, and the opportunities for any kind of earning a living and careers of various kinds, academic or otherwise, were very, very limited. And still there was a great deal of apprehension about the presence of the Soviet Russian power clearly extending into Eastern and even Central and Western Europe. And so I found an opportunity to come to the United States. And in December 1952, being eligible for immigrant status as a refugee from Eastern Europe, I came probably as maybe one of the last roads of people by boat, by what was an army transport ship, previously by ship to the United States, and have remained here ever since. In the course of these travels, I have become, while born and raised a Roman Catholic, and having initially in Hungary studied for the monastic priesthood with the Cistercian order in Budapest, very lovely people. So let's say come from a long line of Roman Catholics, both on my father's and mother's side. I became acquainted both at an academic level and ultimately at a level of religious practice with Gnosticism, and devoted myself to a very large extent to that, both as a study and as a practice throughout my entire life. So that kind of covers in broad outline form, I think, my career. And if there are any details of that you would like to hear more about, then please be so kind and question me about it.
Sure. One thing that comes in mind is I'd love to hear how your interest in Carl Jung and depth psychology kind of figured into your journey academically and again personally, spiritually. It's another area in which you've published some excellent stuff about Jung's Gnosticism and his mention of the Gnostic Gospel, some excellent works that you've written there. And I just love to hear how that merger happened for you of interests between depth psychology and Gnosticism.
It's something that very largely occurred within myself, but some of my contacts had something to do with it. After 1948, I was in Austria, and there eventually I ended up as the University of Innsbruck in the Tyrol, which is of course just a hop, skip, and a jump from Switzerland. So we had many contacts with people from Switzerland and from the Jung Institute, and when I read some of the first books that I read, of course in German, of Carl Jung, I became very interested in him, and I detected that he had to say the least, a very great interest in Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and of course his many works on alchemy were well known. And so I, let's say, my interest then branched out onto Jung's psychology as well, and I saw in it actually, eventually, after studying a good deal, a modern manifestation of the ancient gnosis. The details of that were not available to us at that time, but eventually they did become available toward the end of the life of C.G. Jung and after his demise, with the Red Book and various other works, that he really had a very vital interest in, particularly Gnosticism, but in the entire the ancient esoteric tradition of Gnosticism, Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, the Alexandrian three-leaved clover, as I like to call it, and that really his psychology, while originally connected, of course, with Sigmund Freud, was really very greatly inspired by the esoteric tradition of the West. By the way, I was just to kind of build a little more credential. By sheer accident, when I was here in the United States already, I became the literary researcher and assistant to one of the, at that time, leading American historical novelists, Irving Stone. And Irving Stone was, I already worked for him a little when he wrote his famous book on Michelangelo, which was then turned into a very successful movie. But I worked with him primarily when he was writing his historical novel about the life of Sigmund Freud. And in the course of that, I had, for my bread and butter, I had to read and digest just about everything that Sigmund Freud ever wrote, which is quite a large literary heritage. And so I was familiar with Jung already from that angle also. And I also developed quite an interest and interest in and respect for Sigmund Freud, who I think was also a very honorable man, who really felt that he discovered a new way of understanding the psyche, and who devoted his life to it greatly. And really the only eventual difference between the two psychoanalytic giants was that Carl Jung was willing to penetrate deeper into the psyche than Sigmund Freud, and Freud remained, well, it's kind of hard to tell, maybe on a little more personalistic level in his interpretation of the psyche, but both of them they're really, like, to use an analogy, like the two pillars, Boaz and Jachin, that hold up the Temple of Solomon. They are the ones who really held up modern psychology. And so I had a kind of a double dose of both, but certainly in terms of my own orientation, I preferred Jung. And I would say that with Jungian psychology, Jungian analysis particularly, as far as I am able to discern, was really intended by Jung as a quasi-religious discipline for the development of the spiritual life of the psyches of his patients. And he really looked upon the analyst as a sort of modern-day priest. And that was a very good idea, although, shall we say, obviously for various reasons, it did not manifest in as major a way as Jung originally intended.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a fascinating aspect to this whole thought world that you've been living in and sharing. Very, very fascinating and interesting. You and I have been using the terms Gnosticism and Gnosis quite a bunch. And while I assume that many of our listeners are at least somewhat familiar with what that term means, I would love to hear, Dr. Hoeller, your kind of, since there are so many different both scholarly and theological definitions of what Gnosticism is and is not, I'd love to hear kind of what you have come up with generally when you use the term Gnosticism. What is it exactly you're talking about?
Well, it is, there are always some difficulties with definitions, especially when the original nomenclature goes back for about 2,000 years. It is a little more difficult to come up with accurate definitions. But I think we need to distinguish really two interrelated phenomena. And one of them is what I would refer to as the tradition of gnosis, which is gnosis just simply meaning in Greek knowing, or a certain kind of knowing. It's certainly not factual or intellectual knowledge, but a kind of interior, intuitive knowing of the deeper realities of life and of the psyche. And I would say that tradition is probably timeless, and that in some fashion it has always existed, although certainly in different cultures and different times, also in different, under different names and different words. And when we come up to the beginning of the Christian era, the first couple of centuries or so, then this Gnostic tradition combined itself in the Middle Eastern Mediterranean matrix, and primarily in the great intellectual, spiritual center of Alexandria in Egypt. It came to combine itself with Christianity. So from then on, really, we have a Christian gnosis, in the sense that it uses the Christian mythos, but very greatly in its own idiosyncratic way. And then, of course, those schisms developed between the Gnostic-oriented Christians and those who came to style themselves Orthodox over a period of time, and eventually the so-called Orthodox, by which we don't mean the Eastern Orthodox of the present time, but those who considered themselves of having the right approach to the faith. This is what came to prevail in Christianity, but right alongside it there were also related traditions, the two biggest ones being Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. Hermeticism being a sort of obscure mystery tradition that came out of Egypt, but eventually became very much combined with Greek philosophy, and Neoplatonism, which is, of course, the cultivation of the mystical content of Plato's philosophy. So these three were all there, and they are the source of the Western esoteric tradition. In a literary sense, for a long time we had much more sources, a much greater number of sources available about Hermeticism and Neoplatonism than about Gnosticism, for apparently the Gnostic writings came to be victimized by sort of the heresiological trend in the church, and they want, because Gnosticism was condemned as a heresy in all its varieties, and therefore the scriptures were destroyed or hidden. But the greatest discovery of original, unadulterated Gnostic writings occurred in our times, right after World War II, when in Upper Egypt the so-called Nag Hammadi library was discovered, an entire library of Gnostic writings, and by the early 1950s, most of these were being translated, and this really produced, at first at the academic level, and subsequently in the broader culture too, a considerable Gnostic renaissance, which in various modifications is still with us. So let's say we knew a good deal about Hermeticism, especially after the Hermetic writings were discovered and then translated, published at the time of the Renaissance. We knew a considerable amount about Neoplatonism through the writings of Plotinus and Porphyry and Iamblichus and people like that. But we really only obtained a good deal of authentic literature about Gnosticism proper in the latter part of the 20th century. And so now we have really a great deal of literary material, of literary sources available, which are giving, I think, people a much more balanced and much more accurate picture of these particular traditions. So we have often, maybe with some hyperbole, called the present era the Gnostic Renaissance. And this, of course, works itself out in various ways.
Mm-hmm. That's
so
excellent.
I think I'll stop my monologue there for a minute.
No, that's excellent. That's excellent. Thank you. I love the distinction you draw, which I think is a very important distinction. I think a lot of folks that have looked at Gnosticism from both a scholarly, historical angle and a theological, spiritual angle, is that there is what some would call historical Gnosticism, and of course there's so many different groups of Gnostics that existed, which are sort of historically lumped into one by some based on some characteristics, and then you acknowledge that there is a tradition, a much broader and perhaps endless tradition of gnosis. And what strikes me is the notion that there has been an undercurrent, a mystical undercurrent within and of course beyond Christianity that has maintained that gnosis, whether or not it has been carried forth by folks that are working with that explicit framework. I remember one of the first times you and I talked, you had the coolest line I ever heard that I'm going to steal about Emanuel Swedenborg. You said, "Emanuel von Swedenborg, saint and seer, transmitter of the gnosis to the new age." And I'm gonna steal that from you, and but it speaks to something, which is that a lot of people think of Gnosticism and of gnosis more specifically, of that mystical experience, as something that is historical. And what you bring up is no, there's very much a gnosis, a Gnosticism that exists and has existed. And what I find most startling is that a lot of people who are somewhat familiar with Gnosticism historically and scholarly are unaware that there has been, as you said, revivals of the Gnostic traditions recently, in recent history, of which, of course, the Ecclesia Gnostica is one. So I'd love to kind of hear your take on, or maybe give folks a little bit of info about what some call the neo-Gnostic movement. I don't like that term because it implies that there's it implies that it's not the same thing. It is a revival when in fact it is a continuation. But how would you kind of give folks a little bit of an overview of how you view the kind of Renaissance.
All right. We'll try to make it make it concise.
Uh-huh.
Let's say the Gnostic tradition as a living tradition, which people would practice rather than merely study in a literary fashion or something, has also always been present. And it certainly has been present since the official, let's say, the external manifestations of Gnosticism went underground, say by the 4th century or so forth. It has continued, but it has continued very largely in an underground manner. I have often likened it to a river that at a certain point goes underground, and then you can't see the river anymore, but you can still see some of the plants and some of the trees that grow beside the underground river. So I would say that the Gnostic tradition, in some fashion, has always been present, at least in Western culture. Now, of course, that there are gnosis in other cultures is, of course, true. And some of the scholars have even indicated, there was one German scholar, I can't think of his name at the present moment, over recent times, I heard him lecture still here in Seattle. Gosh, why can't I think of him? In any event, who said that Buddhism was the Gnosticism of Asia. And he identified the tremendous parallelisms, which I sometimes use, between again the essential approach of Buddhism and its striving for enlightenment, and the essential features of Gnosticism striving for gnosis. So let's say there was always something there, and then from time to time throughout history it would resurface in various ways. And for instance, there were a few open and fairly numerous Gnostic movements that arose throughout history in Europe, such as the Cathars, or as they used to call them, the Albigensians, in what is now the south of France and in that area, which was probably, at least to some extent, of Manichaean origin. Then, of course, much earlier, the Manichaean faith, which was very, very widespread and which really extended from China to the Mediterranean region and elsewhere. And these were all, we might say, manifestations of Gnosticism in the sense of being built on the proposition of gnosis, but also often having fairly detailed theologies that were considerably similar to each other. And then we had, let's say, the revival of esotericism in the latter. Well, it was there all along, because particularly Hermetic revivals occurred in European history several times. Once in the Quattrocento and Quinquecento, when in the Renaissance, when the Hermetic books, Corpus Hermeticum and other Hermetic books were discovered. Another Hermetic revival, in addition to that, maybe at the time of the Enlightenment, which was probably the last big Hermetic revival. So there have been revivals of these various esoteric traditions. From time to time, they would just come forward, And then, of course, was, let's say, the great occult revival of starting in the late 19th century, of which perhaps the most prominent external representative was Madame Blavatsky with her theosophical movement starting in 1875. So these things all came together, and after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library particularly, and then the beginning of the exegesis of those materials, like Professor Elaine Pagels' really very popular work, The Gnostic Gospels. Now the Gnostic tradition under the name of Gnostic was out in the open already. But let's say this is at the scriptural, theological level. But it is my impression that or at the level of a spiritual practice or spiritual practices, it has also been present. Certainly, the Qatars openly had a church with its bishops, with its deacons, with its congregation, with its worship, and all of that. And there were others. It was only difficult to do that sort of thing because of the persecutions that came from Christian Orthodoxy, both Roman Catholic and Protestant. But so there was something there. It wasn't something dead that was revived, but maybe something that was functioning at the minimalist and secret level for a long time, and that taken various forms, that morphed sometime into this, sometime into that, but with all of which I think legitimately can be called as being of a Gnostic character. Now, of course, that needs to be distinguished to the scriptural material, the Gnostic Gospels, although, I mean, there are some, very large number of books that were discovered in the Nag Hammadi find, and there we have theological or maybe mythological, mytho-theological material that sort of serves as the theoretical underpinning. But let's say Gnostic movements have always been here, but because of external circumstances, they always kept a low profile. This no longer became necessary in the 20th century, or now in the 21st century. So that has to do with gnosis as a practice, gnosis as an ongoing spiritual tradition. And then in addition to that, of course, there are the scriptures which come back from ancient times and which have been the originals, some of the originals probably authored as early as the 1st and 2nd century, and the copies that we have of 3rd and 4th century, which gave the scholars the material to work with. So we have both a scholarly and academic Gnostic revival beginning in the 20th century, and then also a revival of Gnostic practice, so that little Gnostic churches, Gnostic groups that may not call themselves churches, have sprung up ever since the latter part of the 19th century, and scholarship even regards such 19th century occult movements as, let us say, the Theosophy as a form of Gnosticism. It again depends as to how precise your definitions become. But Gnosticism as a spiritual practice, as a religious form of the endeavor of the human soul has been with us in a minimalist fashion for a long time, and now it is sort of coming out of the shadows increasingly, so that it can be found even in little church groups in those countries where religious freedom is prevalent, like in the United States, including our little Gnostic church that I have been responsible for reviving and then working with and leading through these many decades.
Excellent. Yeah, well, that brings us all the way back around to our initial discussion topic, which was esoteric ecumenism, as I like to call it. And you and I have talked about the kind of the prospects, the current state of spirituality in the West, and I've shared my optimism to a large degree about particularly younger folks who are, in fact, rejecting established religion, having an appreciation, perhaps even a new appreciation, an increasing appreciation for traditions that engage our narratives, including the Christian narrative, on an inner level. There seems to be a readiness and openness, in my opinion, among folks to explore that inner.
Perhaps you have more experience with that particular stratum of American society, but I'm a little bit pessimistic because while I certainly have had those kinds of contacts, especially in the 1960s, and so periodically the interest seems to be swelling. But on the whole, I'm concerned that a secularist, or what they like to call a secular trend, which is very often not much more than materialism manqué, as we call in French, is present, and I only see a considerably small minority of any age group that really has a vital interest in these esoteric matters, although obviously it is present. So I would say the potential for a Gnostic revival at a maybe larger scale is possible, but I'm not so sure whether it is likely.
Well, that's a very valid perspective, and I love that tension, and that brings me once again to kind of perhaps in conclusion to something I'd love to address with you, which is first of all your own role and your experience with being with the Ecclesia Gnostica involved in trying to keep an inner tradition alive and to promulgate it to a certain point. And that leads me to ask humbly and appreciatively about what advice you may have for us in the Swedenborgian Church of North America as you are very familiar with a small movement that struggles to gain traction and that many seekers are still responding to, and I believe on a renewed level. But what is your recommendation, your suggestion as we move forward in time?
Well, of course, in chronological terms, we have a little discrepancy here because our little movement is of comparatively recent origin, at least externally, although there actual Gnostic church with sacramental practice and so has come forth already at the turn of the 19th to 20th 20th century, in the late 19th century. So let's see, the sort of thing that we are doing did not originate with us. So it has been there all along. And the Swedenborgian teachings or tradition historically, let's say, came out with Emanuel Swedenborg and his followers at an earlier time. I mean, he was 18th century, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
So in a certain sense, outwardly, as far as an open manifestation of this tradition, the Swedenborgian is one of the earliest ones because it began early in European history. But let's say, it would be presumptuous for me to offer advice to representatives of another tradition, but I would say that probably the greatest likelihood of gaining a Gnostic-like following for any esoteric movement at the present time would be to point to its the individual and personal gnosis, which is embodied there and which it tries to cultivate. In other words, my knowledge of the subject is limited, but let's say Emanuel von Swedenborg was a great prophetic figure because he had a certain kind of gnosis. He was a knower. He was a knower of the mysterious inner worlds and great many things. And so if it can be made understandable to people that the kind of thing that Swedenborg knew can also be known by others.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is it is an experiential process. Certainly it can be inspired by the writings of Swedenborg because all traditions are inspired by their prophets. But it ultimately comes down to the individual gnosis of the followers. And I think that is probably still a viable position with some modifications.
Yes, I love that, and it very much ties into my own thoughts about the future of Western esotericism and mystical Christianity, and Swedenborgianism in specific, is perhaps a renewed willingness towards the experiential side, the experience of that inner regeneration, that depth, that knowing, that gnosis.
Yeah, that is of course of very great importance, but let's say one also has to consider along with that on the other side, and I always like to harken back to the definition of the ancient Greeks with the mysteries and similar developments of theoria and theurgia.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so there has to be, the theurgia is the practice, is the experience of gnosis, the experience of the inner worlds, whatever the case may be. But there also, what happens then after a while, that in order to assimilate these experiences, there has to be some kind of theoretical framework, the theoria. And so I think that both have to be there. And certainly the ancient Gnostics offered a lot of theoria, and the Naj-Hammadi scriptures are filled with them, from which there can be deduced certain principles, which are sort of in the nature of mystical theology. In order, you see, this was the problem, for instance, it always is the problem, but this was the problem, for instance, with the spiritual side of the 60s phenomenon, and I was here already, and I knew a lot of young people and things like that, so I knew what was going on. I even knew personally a number of leading figures of the psychedelic movement, believe it or not. But if you are in these circles, you bump into all kinds of people. But people have experiences and they want to understand them. And if they don't have any kind of even a basic theoretical framework within which these experiences find their place, then the experience goes away.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even its memory, people forget about it because they say, yeah, I experienced some things then, and it sure was great and all that, but I don't really know what it was all about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that these two elements need to be considered. And so there is considerable merit, I think, to the great Gnostic myths, the teachings as well, not as the foundation of a dogmatic theology, which they were never intended to be, quite the opposite, but as attempts to approach gnosis and to assimilate gnosis and understand the experiences that may come to the individual as the result of his own personal gnosis.
Wonderful. Excellent. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Bishop Hoeller. This has been...
You are so very welcome, and I'm very glad that we made the contact, by the way, at the conference. And I already spoke to one friend of mine in Walnut Creek who said he had been to your church at some point in San Francisco. You are within the city of San Francisco itself?
So we have a church there in San Francisco. We at Hillside, Swedenborgian, are located just across the bay in El Cerrito.
So you have actually two establishments there.
We do, absolutely. Yep.
I see. I was not aware of that.
Yeah. Come check us out in El Cerrito sometime. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And once again, thank you, Bishop Hoeller. It has been a pleasure. I highly recommend Bishop Hoeller's many publications. I also highly recommend you familiarizing yourself with the Ecclesia Gnostica and the Gnostic Society. There's several great resources if you go to gnosis.org and so forth. And of course, I encourage you to check out the ministries of the Swedenborgian Church of North America, including this very program, which is, again, our daily bread at spiritualquesters.org. Messages from the Swedenborgian Church of North America. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, and God bless you and your people, and I hope we have further contact.
Thank you, Bishop Hoeller.
Okay.